My life was quiet, my days predictable, just the way I liked them. I have always been someone who valued peace and routine. Each morning I would wake up at 6, brew my coffee, and watch the sunrise from my back porch. The property had been my sanctuary for 15 years. 3 acres of land with a modest house that I had renovated myself, nestled in the Oak Ridge Estates subdivision. The kind of neighborhood where lawns were meticulously maintained and holiday decorations went up like clockwork. I had worked hard to secure my little patch of heaven, tucked in a neighborhood where the grass stayed cut and the sidewalks stayed clean. My grandfather had purchased this land before the development had even been planned. When the developers came through in the 90s, they built around our property, creating an unusual boundary that left me with more land than my neighbors. I treasured every inch of it. The Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association had formed shortly after construction finished. I paid my dues on time, followed their rules about exterior paint colors and trash can placement, and generally kept to myself. I never attended meetings, never complained about violations, never made waves. That was not my style. I just wanted to be left alone with my garden and my books. But everything changed the day I heard the whine of drills and the rumble of utility trucks outside my fence. The sounds jolted me awake before my alarm. I stepped onto my front porch, coffee cup in hand, and froze. 3 large white trucks with Wilkinson Electric printed on their sides were parked along the road. Men in hard hats were unloading equipment, examining blueprints, and marking the ground with orange spray paint. I watched as metal poles rose like skeletons on the edge of my land. The workers moved with efficiency, digging holes, cementing bases, and hoisting tall wooden utility poles into place. Wires stretched between them like ominous spiderwebs. I set my coffee down and walked toward the nearest worker, a heavy-set man with a clipboard. "Excuse me," I said. "What exactly is going on here?" The man barely looked up. "Power line extension, HOA project." "But this is my property," I said, pointing to the survey marker clearly visible near his feet. The worker shrugged. "Not my department, sir. We just follow the plans. You will need to talk to your HOA." I walked back inside and immediately called my neighbor, Alina, who had lived in the community for decades and seemed to know everything that happened within its borders. "Oh yes," she said, her voice bright with excitement. "The board voted last month to expand power access to the new community spaces. They acquired some grid rights or something like that. Is not it wonderful? The clubhouse will finally have enough power for those big events they have been planning." I hung up and pulled out my property documents. The boundaries were clear. A 20-foot section of my eastern property line had poles running directly through it. According to county records, no easement had ever been granted. No one had asked my permission. No one had even notified me. That afternoon, I drove to the HOA office, a small room attached to the community clubhouse. Janice, the association's administrative assistant, greeted me with a practiced smile. "I need to speak with someone about the power line installation," I said. "Let me find Mr. Peterson for you," she replied. Minutes later, I was face to face with Richard Peterson, the HOA vice president. He was a small man with an oversized presence, dressed in a golf shirt with the community logo embroidered on the chest. "We have been looking forward to this upgrade for years," he said before I could even explain my concern. "Finally got approval last quarter. The whole neighborhood will benefit from the improved infrastructure." "The poles are on my land," I said firmly. "No one asked my permission. No one filed for an easement." Peterson's smile did not waver, but his eyes hardened. "Actually, according to our legal team, the community infrastructure clause in your covenant gives us access rights for essential utilities. It is all very standard." "I have read my covenant. There is nothing about you installing permanent structures on my private property." "Well," he said, leaning back in his chair, "perhaps you should read it again. Besides, we own the grid now. It is a done deal. The papers are signed." As I left the office, my hands were shaking, not from fear, but from a combination of anger and disbelief. They had crossed a line, literally and figuratively, and they seemed to think I would just accept it. They had just made a very big mistake. I tried to play by the rules. The next morning, I drafted a formal complaint to the HOA board, detailing the property violation and requesting immediate cessation of construction until proper easements could be negotiated. I cited county ordinances, property law statutes, and the specific boundaries documented in my deed. I hand-delivered it to Janice, who promised to pass it along to the board. Days passed. The construction continued unabated. Crews worked from morning until evening, installing more poles, stringing more wire, connecting more components. I called the HOA office daily, but Janice's responses grew increasingly vague. "The board is reviewing your concerns," she would say, or "Mr. Peterson will get back to you soon." After a week of silence, I received a letter. The envelope bore the official HOA logo, and inside was a single page of legal letterhead. The message was brief and dismissive. "Upon review of your complaint dated June 7th, the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association Legal Counsel has determined that the power infrastructure project falls under the implied community easements outlined in Section 12, Paragraph B of the Neighborhood Covenant. No further action is required at this time." I read the letter 3 times, my frustration mounting with each pass. The reference section spoke only of temporary access for repairs and maintenance, not permanent installations. They were twisting the words to suit their needs. The next day, I visited the county permit office. I spoke with an administrator named Derek, who pulled up the records for the power line project. "Yes, I see the permits here," he said, scrolling through his computer. "All approved for Oak Ridge Estates common areas and designated utility zones." "But what about my property?" I asked. "Parcel 421087. Derek checked again. "No, there is nothing here about that parcel. If they are building on private property, they would need separate permits and probably an easement." "So what can the county do about this violation?" Derek shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Well, technically, this would be a civil matter between you and the HOA. The county does not intervene in property disputes unless there is an immediate safety concern." I was being stonewalled at every turn. Meanwhile, the power lines were completed within days. I could see them from my kitchen window, ugly black snakes suspended in the air above my eastern property line. The HOA wasted no time in connecting them to their facilities. The clubhouse, the community pool, the newly built entertainment pavilion, all now powered by lines that crossed my land without permission. And to add insult to injury, my own electricity became unstable. Lights flickered in the evenings. My refrigerator hummed erratically. Twice, I had to reset my circuit breakers after mysterious outages. When I called the power company, they suggested the problems might be related to the recent grid modifications in your area. I decided to attend the monthly HOA meeting. I had never gone before, but now I needed to make my case directly to the full board. The meeting was held in the clubhouse's main hall, a room now brilliantly lit by new overhead fixtures powered by my stolen easement. I sat quietly through reports on landscaping contracts and pool maintenance schedules. When the meeting opened for resident comments, I raised my hand. The board president, William Clark, acknowledged me with obvious reluctance. "My name is," I began, standing to address the room. "I am here about the power lines installed across my property without permission." William cut me off before I could continue. "I believe this matter has already been addressed by our legal team," he said firmly. "No, it has not been addressed," I insisted. "No one has actually listened to my concerns or—" "Sir," William interrupted again, "we have procedures for filing complaints, and this open forum is not the appropriate venue for rehashing settled matters. We need to move on to other business." "This is not settled," I said, my voice rising. "You have violated my property rights, and I demand—" William banged his gavel. "You are out of order. Please sit down, or you will be asked to leave." The room fell silent. I looked around at my neighbors, hoping to see some support, but most avoided my gaze. A few even nodded in agreement with William. I had been effectively silenced and humiliated in front of the entire community. As I turned to leave, Richard Peterson, the vice president who had dismissed me earlier, leaned toward his microphone. "Just to clarify for everyone," he said with unmistakable smugness, "the power infrastructure upgrades benefit the entire community. No individual homeowner owns the power. We do. The association manages these resources for everyone's benefit. I walked out, my face burning with embarrassment and rage. They had stolen my property, dismissed my concerns, and now publicly humiliated me. I left that night burning, not just with anger, but with the first spark of an idea. If they thought they owned the power, they had forgotten who built this neighborhood's foundation. I was done asking nicely. Fate introduced me to the right man at the right time. 2 nights after the disastrous HOA meeting, I found myself at McCluskey's, a quiet bar on the edge of town. I was not usually one for drinking alone, but my house felt suffocating, the view of those power lines a constant reminder of my helplessness. I sat at the bar, nursing a whiskey, when I overheard a conversation 2 stools down. A gray-haired man was talking about power grids and utility companies. My ears perked up. 30 years at Western Electric, the man was saying. Saw the whole system change. Used to be simple. Now it is all corporations and subsidiaries buying and selling access rights like it is the stock market. I moved to the empty stool beside him. "Excuse me," I said. "I could not help overhearing. You worked for the electric company." He turned to me, eyes bright beneath bushy eyebrows. "Charlie Dawson," he said, extending a weathered hand. "Senior distribution engineer, retired 3 years ago. I have a question about power lines, if you do not mind." Charlie laughed. "Son, I answered questions about power lines for 3 decades. One more will not kill me." I explained my situation, the HOA's unauthorized installation, their claims of ownership, my failed attempts to fight back. Charlie listened, occasionally shaking his head or grunting in disapproval. "Your neighborhood is one of the old ones," he said when I finished. "Built during the utility restructuring, those neighborhoods sometimes got caught in limbo." "What do you mean?" "Most power systems are public utilities, regulated by the state. But during the 80s and 90s, some smaller grids were privatized during a deregulation experiment. Companies would buy segments of the distribution network, especially in new developments." He pulled out a napkin and sketched a rough diagram. "The main grid is public," he explained, drawing lines. "But sometimes these neighborhood feeder lines and substations are privately owned, then leased to the power company for operation. Your HOA might have acquired some ownership rights, but there is always a paper trail." We met again the next day at the county records office. Charlie knew exactly where to look and which forms to request. We discovered that our neighborhood's power infrastructure had indeed been privatized during construction, but not in the way the HOA had implied. "Here it is," Charlie said, pointing to a document. "Phoenix Utility Partners owned your neighborhood grid until they went bankrupt in 2008. The assets were acquired by Regional Power Distribution, but they only leased the operating rights to the power company. The actual ownership of the physical infrastructure is held by." "Interesting." "What?" I leaned over to see. "It is held by a holding company called Oak Ridge Energy Holdings. And according to this filing, they have put the distribution rights up for sale again, quietly, through a bankruptcy proceeding." "Can anyone buy these rights?" I asked, an idea forming. Charlie looked at me curiously. "Technically, yes, any qualified buyer, but it would not be cheap." That night, I reviewed my finances. I had been fortunate in my investments over the years. My portfolio was healthy, with significant holdings in tech stocks that had performed exceptionally well. I had been saving for early retirement, but this was more important. I contacted a business attorney the next morning. We discussed the legality of purchasing utility distribution rights, the responsibilities involved, and the potential pitfalls. It was complex but doable. My attorney connected me with a broker who specialized in utility assets. "The asking price is steep," the broker warned during our call, "and there will be regulatory approvals needed. Are you sure you want to pursue this?" "I am sure," I said without hesitation. I liquidated a significant portion of my investment portfolio. The broker helped me create a shell company to make the purchase less conspicuous. We submitted a bid through proper channels, all while maintaining absolute secrecy. The HOA continued their regular business, unaware that a change in ownership was underway. The process took weeks. There were forms to file, regulations to satisfy, conditions to meet. I signed countless documents, transferred large sums of money, and held my breath. Charlie helped me understand the technical aspects and introduced me to contacts who could manage the operational side once the purchase was complete. Then on a Thursday afternoon, my attorney called. "Congratulations," she said. "Your bid has been accepted. All conditions have been met. The transfer is complete." I did not sleep that night. I made calls, moved money, signed contracts, and hushed offices. I made myself invisible just like they had made me. Weeks later, a simple envelope arrived confirming it. I owned the flow beneath their feet. The very infrastructure that powered the HOA facilities, the streetlights, and yes, even the homes of the board members now belonged to me. They had trespassed on my land. Now I controlled the wires above theirs. It was not revenge. It was reclamation. I wanted them to feel, if only for 1 hour, what they had done to me. But I needed to be careful. My attorney confirmed that as the legal owner of the local distribution infrastructure, I had certain rights regarding access and control. However, I could not simply cut power arbitrarily without potentially facing legal consequences. Charlie introduced me to Miguel, a former colleague who specialized in smart grid technology. "If you own the node, you can install monitoring equipment," Miguel explained. "Perfectly legal. Utility companies do it all the time to track usage patterns and manage load distribution." Together, we devised a plan. Miguel installed a sophisticated control system at the main junction box serving the Oak Ridge estates. The equipment allowed for remote monitoring and management, including the ability to redirect power flow or shut it down entirely in case of emergency maintenance. "Just be smart about how you use this," Miguel warned as he finished the installation. "Selective outages for legitimate testing purposes are defensible. Vindictive shutdowns are not." I consulted with my attorney again, outlining exactly what I intended to do. We drafted documentation for a grid integrity test and emergency maintenance procedure to create a paper trail justifying any actions I might take. Then I waited for the perfect moment. It came sooner than expected. The HOA had been planning their annual summer celebration for months. Flyers had gone up around the neighborhood advertising live music, catered food, and dancing under the stars at the newly renovated clubhouse. The event would showcase the improved electrical capacity that allowed for bigger, better community gatherings. The day of the celebration arrived. From my home, I could hear the music starting as the sun began to set. I watched through binoculars as cars filled the clubhouse parking lot. Board members greeted guests at the door. William Clark, the HOA president, stood at a podium, likely preparing to give a self-congratulatory speech about the neighborhood improvements. At 8:30 precisely, when the party was in full swing, I opened my laptop and connected to the control system. My finger hovered over the key that would execute the emergency maintenance protocol. I thought about every dismissive word, every ignored complaint, every moment of powerlessness I had endured. I pressed enter. The system confirmed, power diverted from non-essential circuits. On my security cameras, I could see the streetlights along the main boulevard flicker and die. Through my binoculars, I watched as the clubhouse plunged into darkness. The music stopped abruptly. Emergency lights provided minimal illumination as confused party guests stood in clusters, looking around. I imagined the chaos inside, the refrigerators stopping, food beginning to warm, the air conditioning units shutting down in the summer heat, the expensive sound system falling silent, the overhead fans ceasing their cooling rhythm. Within minutes, my phone rang. It was a number I did not recognize. I let it go to voicemail. It rang again immediately, and again. Text messages began to arrive from neighbors asking if my power was out too. I did not respond. Through my security system, I could see cars beginning to leave the clubhouse parking lot. The celebration was ending prematurely as guests departed in confusion and frustration. I could see board members huddled near the entrance, gesturing animatedly, likely on phones with the power company. 3 hours later, my doorbell rang. I checked the camera before answering. William Clark stood on my porch, his face flushed with anger even in the dim porch light. I opened the door but did not invite him in. "We have an emergency," he said without greeting. "The power is out at the clubhouse and the main streets. The power company says they cannot restore service because the local distribution node is under new ownership." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "They gave us your name." I leaned against the doorframe, my expression neutral. "Yes, that is correct." William's face went from red to purple. "This must be a mistake," he sputtered. "How could you possibly?" "No," I replied calmly. "This is power returning to its rightful owner." The news spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. By morning, everyone knew that I had somehow acquired ownership of the local power grid. Most residents' homes were unaffected. I had only targeted HOA facilities and the board members' personal residences, but the implications were clear. The balance of power had shifted. Richard Peterson was the first board member to approach me directly. He arrived at my door the day after the failed celebration, his usual smugness replaced by a thinly veiled desperation. "We should discuss this situation like reasonable people," he said, forcing a conciliatory smile. "I am sure we can come to an arrangement that benefits everyone." "I am listening," I replied, not inviting him inside. "The HOA is prepared to offer you a very generous settlement if you will transfer the utility rights back to the association. We can also draft a formal easement agreement for the power lines on your property, with appropriate compensation." It was a backdoor deal designed to quickly and quietly restore their control. I almost laughed at the transparency of it. "That is an interesting offer," I said. "Here is my counter. The HOA will issue a public apology for installing power lines without proper permission. You will pay market rate for the easement retroactive to the date of installation. You will remove the board members who approved this project, and you will implement new bylaws requiring homeowner approval for any infrastructure changes affecting private property." Peterson's fake smile vanished. "That is completely unreasonable. The board would never agree to such terms." "Then I suppose the clubhouse will remain dark," I said, closing the door. The next day, I received a formal letter from the HOA's legal team. It outlined potential claims against me for interfering with essential community services and abusing utility ownership rights. The letter threatened lawsuits, injunctions, and regulatory complaints if power was not immediately restored. I forwarded the letter to my attorney, who called me within the hour. "They are bluffing," she said. "They have no standing to force you to provide services to specific locations. As long as you maintain service to residential homes, you are fulfilling the basic regulatory requirements." "What about their threats of legal action?" "I took the liberty of researching the HOA's financial records," she replied. "They are public after all, and I found some very interesting discrepancies in their handling of capital improvement funds. It seems the board has been less than transparent about certain expenditures, including, perhaps, how they acquired those power lines in the first place." Armed with this information, I decided to increase the pressure. That evening, I selectively cut power to 3 additional board members' homes. Not continuously, but in unpredictable patterns, enough to make refrigerators warm, alarm systems reset, and air conditioners fail during the hottest part of the day. The phone calls began the next morning, first from Jennifer Aldridge, the HOA secretary. "My children cannot sleep in this heat," she said, her voice tight with strain. "Whatever your issue is with the board, my family should not suffer for it." "I understand your concern," I replied calmly. "But when I raised concerns about power lines on my property, I was told that individual homeowners do not matter. Only the community matters. I am simply applying the board's own logic." By the end of the week, 2 board members had resigned their positions. Others began reaching out privately, distancing themselves from the decisions that had led to this conflict. The unified front was crumbling. On Saturday morning, a black SUV pulled into my driveway. William Clark stepped out, alone this time. He looked exhausted, the confident bluster gone from his bearing. When I opened the door, he did not speak immediately. "May I come in?" he finally asked. I stepped aside, allowing him into my home for the first time. We sat in my living room, the power lines visible through the window behind him. "You have made your point," he said, his voice subdued. "What will it take to end this?" I laid out my terms again, this time in greater detail. A full public apology, complete removal of the power lines from my property, or fair market compensation for a properly documented easement. New HOA bylaws protecting homeowners from similar overreach, and a complete audit of HOA financial records for the past 5 years. William winced at the last item but did not object. "And if we agree to these terms?" "Then the lights come back on." He nodded slowly. "I will take this to the remaining board members." I was not just some angry homeowner anymore, I was the storm they had unleashed. When the HOA president showed up at my door, he looked 10 years older. He did not come to argue, he came to negotiate. 3 days later, an emergency HOA meeting was called. Notices were hand-delivered to every home in the neighborhood. The meeting would be held at the clubhouse, still without power, at 7 in the evening. Residents were advised to bring flashlights. I arrived early and took a seat in the back row. The room filled quickly, neighbors murmuring among themselves, the atmosphere tense with anticipation. Battery-powered lanterns cast long shadows across the walls. The board members sat at their table at the front, looking uncomfortable in the dim light. William called the meeting to order. "As you all know," he began, his voice echoing in the quiet room, "we have experienced some difficulties with our power infrastructure. After extensive discussion, the board has prepared a resolution to address these issues." He nodded to Janice, who distributed printed copies of the resolution to the board members. In the weak light, they leaned forward to read. Resolution 2023-14, William read aloud. Regarding the unauthorized installation of power lines on private property located at parcel 421087. Point by point, he read through the document. The HOA acknowledged that proper procedures had not been followed. The board accepted responsibility for failing to secure proper easements and permits. A formal apology was extended to me, by name, for disregarding my property rights and dismissing my legitimate concerns. The resolution continued. The HOA would compensate me at market rates for the encroachment. The power lines would be properly documented with the county, with appropriate easement payments made annually. Most significantly, the HOA bylaws would be amended to require written consent from affected homeowners before any infrastructure projects could proceed. Furthermore, William continued, his voice growing tired, the board has approved a complete financial audit of all capital improvement projects from the past 5 years. The results will be made public to all homeowners. When he finished reading, the room was silent. Then Jennifer Aldridge spoke up from the board table. "I move to approve Resolution 2023-14. Richard Peterson, looking defeated, raised his hand. "I second the motion." "All in favor?" William asked. The remaining board members raised their hands, one by one. "The resolution passes unanimously," William announced. He looked toward where I sat in the shadows. "As a sign of good faith, we request that normal power service be restored to community facilities." I stood and walked to the front of the room. All eyes followed me as I pulled out my phone and opened the control app. Without speaking, I tapped the screen several times, authorizing the restoration protocol. Gradually, almost dramatically, the lights above flickered to life. The air conditioning units hummed as they restarted. Appliances in the kitchen beeped as they reset. A spontaneous round of applause broke out among the residents. It was not just electricity, it was control, and I had earned it. The quiet returned, but it was different now. Spring turned to summer, and I invested in new fencing along my eastern property line. Not a tall privacy fence, just a clear boundary marked with survey posts and a tasteful rail design. At each corner, small but unmistakable signs read, "Private property easement by permission only." The power lines remained, now properly documented with the county. Each year, the HOA would pay a fair market rate for the right to maintain them on my land. The money was not important to me, the principle was what mattered. The HOA installed a glass case in the clubhouse lobby where copies of all infrastructure plans, permits, and affected property agreements were displayed for all residents to view. Transparency had become the new watchword of the board, now populated by a new set of neighbors after several resignations. The financial audit had revealed what my attorney had suspected: years of questionable spending, undocumented consulting fees, and inflated contracts with companies connected to former board members. No criminal charges were filed, but the results were published in the monthly newsletter. The court of public opinion rendered its own judgment. I continued to own the local power distribution rights, though I contracted with a professional management company to handle the day-to-day operations. Charlie consulted occasionally, making sure everything ran smoothly. We had become friends through this unlikely adventure, meeting for coffee most Thursdays to discuss books, politics, and the occasional power grid innovation. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now waved when they drove past. Some even stopped to chat about gardening or the weather. There was a deeper silence, a respect born not of fear but of understanding. The story had spread throughout the community, growing with each retelling. I had become something of a local legend, the man who bought the power grid to fight the HOA. I saw William Clark once, trimming his hedges like a regular neighbor. Our eyes met briefly across the street. We nodded to each other. No words were needed. The balance had been restored. One evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sunset, I reflected on the strange journey of the past year. I had fought not just for property, but for principle. Along the way, I had learned how fragile power really is, both the electrical kind and the human kind. Systems that seem permanent can change in an instant. Authority that seems absolute can crumble when challenged. The power lines above my property no longer bothered me. They had become a reminder, a monument to standing your ground, to fighting back, to reclaiming what is rightfully yours. My story is not a warning. It is a reminder. Even when the wires run against you, all it takes is one person willing to flip the switch.